13th, 2021, Professor Adrian Dixon at the University of Illinois is quoted in the USA Today as saying, quote, "The recent wave of attention on critical race theory didn't start with Trump, but rather became crystallized during his administration. Former President Barack Obama's election was shocking and traumatic for people who always imagined the U.S. as a white nation. And since then, there's been a profound ignorance about what critical race theory really is." There may be ignorance as to what critical race theory is, but not from conservatives. Though the author of this article writes, quote, "Many conservatives' views are that critical race theory portrays the United States as a racist country, that certain people are inherently oppressive, and that those people are accountable for the sins committed by their predecessors. In their interpretation, the theory seeks to make particular individuals, namely white people, feel uncomfortable and guilty about their race," close quote. Well, yes, when you have course material on how not to be white and what traits are part and parcel of certain races, like work and family formation, and of course, seeing the problem of family formation in some of our minority communities, adopting Karl Marx's belief that the Western family structure simply must be demolished. When you teach children as preschoolers that racial differences matter, and when you teach the rest of society that America was born in slavery and that 1776 is not our founding, but slavery in 1619 was, though no founder believed or knew of that or thought of that before, yes, you can communicate that certain people are inherently oppressive and this country is to be lamented rather than celebrated. A few other thoughts arise. When in the 1990s these kinds of things were being said by the likes of Leonard Jeffries, do you remember him? He was a kook at the City University of New York who had the theory that, to quote from the Baltimore Sun, that laboriously brought forth the notion of racial superiority based on skin color. Dr. Jeffries believes he can, so to speak, separate sheep from goats among us bipeds by examining our melanin. In the Jeffries version of the story of mankind, it is the dark-skinned who are destined to rule. They are the sun people. Whites are the ice people. Anyone remember this? We have children of the sun, he tells blacks, and they came first. And we are the haves. We have had the beginning of the march of humankind. We are the mothers and fathers of civilization. We developed science, mathematics, and philosophy, he said. All of this notion of dark people and light people and warm people and cold people based on race, it was called racial superiority and geneticism in the 19th century. It was called racial superiority in Nazi Germany. It was called racial superiority when Martin Luther King denounced such elements in his movement. It was called racial superiority when we used to be more brave about calling out the likes of Louis Farrakhan. And it is racial superiority today. U.S. Supreme Court Justice and Nuremberg prosecutor Robert Jackson at Nuremberg said this in his closing argument to the jury, quote, "It is common to think of our own time as standing at the apex of civilization, from which the deficiencies of preceding ages may patronizingly be viewed in the light of what is assumed to be progress. The reality is that in the long perspective of history, the present century will not hold an admirable position unless its second half is efforted to redeem its first. These 20 years in this 20th century," he was speaking in 1946, "will be recorded in the book of years as one of the most bloody in all annals. 2 world wars have left a legacy of dead, which number more than all the armies engaged in any war that made ancient or medieval history. No half-century ever witnessed slaughter on such a scale, such cruelties and inhumanities, such wholesale deportations of people into slavery, such annihilations of minorities. The terror of Torquemada pales before the Nazi Inquisition. These deeds are the overshadowing historical facts by which generations to come will remember this decade. If we cannot eliminate the causes and prevent the repetition of these barbaric events, it is not an irresponsible prophecy to say that this 20th century may yet succeed in bringing the doom of civilization, if we cannot eliminate the causes and prevent the repetition of these barbaric events. I'd love to repeat that because it explains in part why the phrase "never again" is one of the worst lies of the 20th and 21st century. If we cannot eliminate the causes and prevent the repetition of these barbaric events, it is not an irresponsible prophecy to say that this 20th century may yet succeed in bringing the doom of civilization. Could be that Robert Jackson was just off by 50 or 60 years. We seem not to have buried the notion, after all, that Jackson called shameful and depraved in his closing arguments, and that, of course, was the classification of people by race, religion, and ethnicity. Shameful and depraved. Whenever I think of these readoptive philosophies of racial superiority and inferiority like we're given from critical race theorists today, telling us to be less white and what are the behavioral traits of black and white people, whenever I think of these resurrections, I think of what I thought was buried at Nuremberg, never to be resurrected. I think of the eerie closing of Robert Jackson's in his last sentence where he said, quote, "The defendants stand before the record of this trial as blood-stained Gloucester stood by the body of his slain king. He begged of the widow as they beg of you, say I slew them not. And the queen replied, then say you were not slain, but dead they are. If you were to say of these men that they are not guilty, it would be as true to say there has been no war, there are no slain, there has been no crime." I think of that when I read from the Smithsonian that there are traits of whiteness and blackness explained by group behavior, religious belief, family formation, work ethic. I think of critical race training sessions that teach people at major corporations how to be less white. I think of our journals capitalizing certain races in their stories to make sure that race's special uniqueness is considered as important. I think of the curricula that teaches children racial composition matters. I think of meetings with parents and teachers that have different phone lines and times for peoples of different races, just like water fountains once upon a time, and lunch counters, and dorms, and colleges, and elementary and secondary schools. Oh, wait, I could be describing today. I find Jackson's summary argument frightening because it is as if we have totally lost the lesson of the Holocaust. We know well, after all, the what of it. We have done worse than ignore the why of it. What do I mean we have done worse with the why of it? Because we are applying and using the same animating ethics that gave purpose and rise to the Holocaust, the notion of genetic and racial superiority and inferiority, the meaning of personhood and humanhood based on nothing more than race. Just saying this, I would have thought, ipso facto, could have ended the arguments about these things some years ago. Now people look at me befuddled, as if I'm speaking Esperanto or something, as if I'm talking about something that makes no sense. And indeed, to too many people, it makes no sense because they've been raised, drenched already in anti-American, anti-Western doctrine, so much so that it's become too difficult to understand, never mind remember, what enemies of America did and what the enemies of America were. And so if we could get to a place where when America is no longer good, how can its enemies be bad? Got it? If America bad, its enemies not so bad. Our self-abnegation leads ineluctably to doubting the wrongness of our enemies. and leads ineluctably to the consideration that our enemies were perhaps not so wrong. This is what happens when we stop teaching, much less understanding the difference between good and evil, and that one can arrive at a difference between good and evil. This is what happens when we stop teaching history. And of course, it becomes awfully difficult to teach the wrongness of geneticism and racial superiority and inferiority when you are touting the beauty of things like others' races' power, or others' races' entitlements based on race, or other races' legalized preferences and immunities based on race, and punishments against others based on race, all of which is the essence of critical race theory. Let me be as clear as I can on the race issues of the day, because they boil down to an awful lot of unlearning. When it comes to matters racial in America, the self-described progressives of today have adopted the philosophy of Jules Streicher. When it comes to the history of our founding in America, the self-described progressives of today have adopted the philosophy and historical analysis of the slaveholding and slave-defending Confederate leaders, using the exact same language about understanding our founding that the Confederate leaders used to justify slavery. In other words, the progressives today have adopted the two most once-upon-a-time signal and unique exemplars of retrograde thinking and resurrected it as enlightened and forward thinking. Who knew you could take the Confederacy and the Third Reich and make its philosophy all well and good and fine and dandy for the progressive cause in America in the 21st and 22nd century, for as far as we can tell. History can repeat itself when it is forgotten, I guess, after all. Helps explain how the leading progressive of the last century, Woodrow Wilson, could air a KKK movie in the White House, though, doesn't it? Another point, if I may. Professor Dixon, whom we quoted above, said, quote, former President Barack Obama's election was shocking and traumatic for people who always imagined the U.S. as a white nation, and since then there's been a profound ignorance about what critical race theory really is, close quote. How was Obama's election shocking and traumatic to white people, or people who imagined that the United States was a white nation? Who thought that? The left thought that, not the right. It was the left that said we were such a racist country we could never elect a black man. We conservatives said, of course we could. And we've said the same thing about women. We were right. America was not a racist nation. They were wrong. Barack Obama received a higher percentage of the white vote than any Democrat other than Jimmy Carter in 1976. He received a higher percentage of the white vote than did George H.W. Bush in 1992, the beau ideal of a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. One final point. While a lot of us were proud to be Americans because of America and others who fought for it, Michelle Obama told us her pride in America came from her ability and her husband's ability to succeed. Patriotism, in other words, was dependent on their success, not others and not their countries, but theirs. Consider, in over 40 years of life at that point, Michelle Obama told us the first time she was proud of America could take her hold because her husband was doing well in the primaries. Did it ever dawn on her she was late to the game and that we all had been proud of America because it could provide the ground, time, and moment for a black man whose middle name was Hussein in a war against terrorism, who could be elected to the presidency of the United States while throttling the most famous politician in America, a war hero and a white man? It could, and we knew it. We conservatives knew this could happen. The left didn't. They were wrong and we were right. About America. Still are. Now let us recall. It was Obama in the Senate who was privately meeting with Louis Farrakhan, after all, while his run for president was being organized. It was Obama who took his children to the church of a Leonard Jeffries acolyte, Jeremiah Wright, and tried to convince us Wright did not stand for the things he broadcast as loudly as he possibly could. You did not see Ronald Reagan or George Bush, either of them, or John McCain or Mitt Romney or Donald Trump, all hated and described as racists in their time by the left. You did not see a one of them ever meet with or countenance the work of white supremacists. You did see them always rushing as fast as possible to denounce them. And just because the media didn't report it didn't mean those trees didn't fall in those forests. We've played audio here of Donald Trump denouncing white supremacy some 16 times, for example. But Donald Trump is routinely described as holding the opposite view because talk radio is the only media that plays those 16 denunciations. Just as the left today is seen as enlightened on their views which are truly resurrections of philosophical and historic luridities. The point: politics and political thinking can be recidivist, and it is today. This makes you and I the true Reform Party in America, at least when it comes to the asylum we're all being put in. I'm Seth. We'll be right back.